Hello, welcome to the True Crime Lounge. My name is Breezy. Here we talk crime. Um, this this is the YouTube to my podcast, in which da 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 there will be a mini series on my podcast coming soon, based on this episode, where I will choose 5 of the 9 cases I'm going to talk about today. So, if you're new here, hit that like button, subscribe, comment, and ring that bell for notifications. I also have a Patreon that you can join as well. By doing that, you will receive access to early, earlier access to videos, as well as merch items. Speaking of merch items, you can go check out the merch shop right now and buy a shirt if you would like. Now, one more thing. You may also find me on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. And as my shirt says, positive vibes only. Because I'm all about that positivity, even though I'm talking about murder or death and kidnapping and crime in general. But if y'all know me, y'all know I love true crime. So, with that being said, why don't we dive into today's episode and we will talk about cases, criminals who thought they could get fully away with it but got caught here on the True Crime Lounge. With our first case being Delamore Vera. Now, I will say this before I begin. I will not say which 5 cases. You have to go watch the miniseries playlist. Wait for the miniseries playlist to find out because I'm in the middle of a miniseries now. It's called Spooky Season. Also, just got done with season 2 of the True Crime Lounge podcast. You can also go check that out. Now, let me get back to it. Delamore Vera. She was 10 days old whenever she died in the house fire. However, her mom was convinced that she'd been abducted. Just before Christmas in 1997, a fire started in the Philadelphia home of Les Cuves. Finding through the smoke and the flames, she ran down where her 10-day daughter Delamere was in her crib, but saw no sign. Suffering, no, suffering burns to her face and at risk of passing out from the smoke inhalation, she quickly got out of the house with her 2 other children. Police quickly put the blaze out when was the primary contained to the bedroom. At the initial search of the newborn, authorities determined that she was perished in the fire, which then caused by an overheated extension cord in the space heater. Human remains were never found in the debris, however, but the investigator concludes that any remains have been incarcerated in the flames. Cuves, however, insisted that her child was still alive and had been kidnapped, but, however, there is no evidence of the kidnapping aside from the desperate plea. It was considered a closed case. So for nearly 6 years, Cuves mourned the loss of her daughter and wondered what had truly become of her. And in 2003, at a birthday party for the acquaintances, she saw a little girl who looked shockingly like her other children and was the exact same age as the lost Delamore. She was able to attain some form of the girl's hair and under to get a reuse of the chewing bubblegum of her hair. With assistance from her state legislator, she had the police open an investigation, test for their DNA, to provide that the 6-year-old Aaliyah Hernandez was actually her daughter, Delamore Vera. The woman who kidnapped Delamore was Carolyn Correa, a cousin of the child's father, Pedro Vera. Cuves and Correa had only met the day before the fire, when Correa came by her house. The following day, she returned, claiming that she had lost her purse upstairs. That's when the blaze started as she left the house. Delamore, still going by Aaliyah, was reunited with her parents the next years, who were both given custody. Her abductor was convicted of kidnapping, arson, and other crimes. Number 2. Dolly Osterick. She claimed her husband was killed by a burglar, but it was actually her lover, whom she kept locked away in the attic. She claimed so. She was a petrified wife that was locked in the closet, as her husband was shot dead lying in the bathroom floor. Though that was the Soon police discovered the responding reports that fired in a Southern California home in 1922, as it looked like a robbery gone wrong. And that's the story, but the tale of Dolly Ostrich was far more complex. Her Wahlberger, Dolly Ostrich, but she went by Dolly, and her husband Fred William Ost- Ostrich had been married for about 25 years. At the time of the shooting, Fred worked long hours and often preferred laying his hands on a bottle of whiskey over his wife. So one day, when Fred sent Otto Stomberger, a 17-year-old working at his factory, over to the house to repair Dolly's sewing machine, Otto and Dolly began having an affair. But with noisy neighbors and the inconvenience of a hotel room, the two were perplexed of how they could see each other without getting caught. Then Dolly had an idea to hide Otto in the attic. Not her brightest, but anyway. During that day, Otto and Dolly, were covert around the house, make the bathtub gin, and spend as much time together as they liked. At night, Otto would retreat to his home to write a pulp fiction novels, hide until the following day, and when Audrey's moved from Milwaukee to Los Angeles, she also took her secret attic lover with them. So one night, Otto heard Dolly and Fred arguing loudly, and he came to the lover's defense with a pistol. A struggle over the gun ensued, and Fred was shot and killed. Otto has set the scene by locking Dolly in the closet and hiding himself in the attic, along with the guns. So for years, police believed Dolly's story of robbery gone wrong, as there is simply no evidence on the contrary. That is, until nearly a decade later after the murder, when a subsequent boyfriend of Dolly's admitted to police that she asked him to ditch a gun in a nearby tar pit, and the neighbors came forward saying that she similarly asked him to bury a gun for her. Though Dolly had both another boyfriend and her another husband, Otto had continued to live in the attic for more than a decade. By the time authorities had enough evidence to arrest Otto, the statute of limitations on manslaughter charges had ran out, and a jury failed to find Dolly guilty of conspiracy. Both walked free, and although they were seemingly went their separate ways at last. Number 3. Sandra Boss. This one actually was a really shocker to me, really. But anyway, Boss didn't discover her husband's true identity for 11 years. In the mid-90s, Stanford graduate Boss was getting her MBA at Harvard when she introduced her sister. Well, her sister introduced her to a man named Clark Rockefeller, a descendant of the famous business family. He wore custom-made designer clothing, collected expensive art, and had an upscale New York apartment. And, charmed, the two married shortly after. Boss and Rockefeller spent the next 11 years where they enjoyed a stable life in large. The boss's job as a consultant of personal wealth. The two had a daughter, Ray Storo Mills Rockefeller, lovingly referred to as Snooks. In 2001, their marriage seemed to begin to crack, as Rockefeller, who was a stay-at-home dad and didn't hesitate to spend boss's money, had continued to keep up his appearance. Says his stories became too inconsistent, and she began to figure out her husband was not who he thought he was. So she was served Rockefeller with divorce in 2007. Since her husband was jobless and a complete mystery, Boss was afforded full custody, and in 2008, she was enjoying one of her 3-day approved visitations with her daughter at his ex-wife's waited in Boston hotel room nearby. When walking through the Boston Common, Rockefeller disappeared with their daughter. An investigator attempted to track down Rockefeller and began questioning for answers. He didn't have a social security card, a driver's license, and even a credit card to his name. When his picture showed up for news of asking for his lease, callers gave at least 4 different identities for the man to go on screen. Investigators were flummoxed. Then a friend came forward with one that would become crucial evidence. Rockefeller had a glass of wine at his friend's house the night before, and the glass had not been washed. Police lifted the fingerprints and got a match to a Christian Karl Gerhardstrader, a German immigrant who had come to the U.S. almost 30 years later. He grew up in a middle-class family in a small town in Germany. There he moved as a teenager, and he stayed with a Connecticut family while claiming to be an exchange student at a local high school. He later got married, landed a job, landing a green card, and moved to Los Angeles under the name of Christopher Chichester. I hope I'm pronouncing this right because I'm terrible at names. He himself, at home in an upper-class neighborhood, weaving a tale of an English ancestry. Proclaiming himself a TV producer, he lived in a back house with a woman named Dee Dee Sohos. Her son, daughter-in-law, John, and Linda Sohos lived on the property. The two went missing in 1985, and Christopher Chichester disappeared shortly afterward. Skeleton remains of the couples were discovered in the backyard of the house. But at that time, Chichester had become Christopher Crowe, and Crowe was once fired from a number of high-level jobs on Wall Street, with no degree, no experience, and no social security number. As people could get wind of his act, investigators tracked Soho's missing truck back to him, and he disappeared again. He was later turned up at Sandra Boss's life as Clark Rockefeller. And after a 5-day manhunt for him, he kidnapped his daughter, and he became Chip Smith. His new alias didn't last long, though. As the owner of the carriage house he rented called an investigator and Snooks was safely returned to her mother, while questioned Christopher Clark, Chip was finally taken into custody. Um, Cherry Rasmussen, for 23 years, her case was, this is number 4. Cherry Rasmussen. For 23 years, her case was dismissed as a robbery gone wrong. But finally, February 24th, 1986, Rutten had been trying to get a hold of his wife all day, but because of it, she hadn't felt good earlier, he didn't think too much about it, and she didn't answer as many of his calls. But pulling into the garage of their Los Angeles area's home, he noticed glass on the ground and her car was missing. Still assumed she was merely hitting the mirror. She merely hit a mirror while backing out. Then he noticed a door entry was slightly ajar. He entered the house, called his wife's name, but just before he saw her, lying on the floor motionless, her body bloody and bruises, and she had a bullet hole straight from her chest. He desperately checked for a pulse. Did not, in disbelief, he called 911. The detective assigned the case to Lyle Meyer. He carefully documented the scene. He made note of the electronics stacked in the living room near her body. To him, it was clear whoever committed the crime had intended to leave with those items, and whatever reason, he had not grabbed them from exiting the scene. He interviewed her husband and the newlywed husband to do his due diligence, but it was just a matter of days when he declared the incident to be a burglary gone wrong. For 23 years, the case went unsolved until Los Angeles Police Department detectives took another look at the case. And as part of their cold case homicide unit, 2009, it was then noticed that the inconsistencies. Sherry had a bite marker on her arm which likely fit a woman. Most burglaries were carried out by men. Rutan's ex-girlfriend, Stephanie Lazarus, had made an unannounced visit to John's home, and the shattered glass all around Rutan had been seen from a bullet traveling inside the house, and outside might as well have been expected to break in. Suddenly, detectives had a prime suspect, which was apparently now premeditated murder. Lazarus, a fellow detective at LAPD, before bringing her into questioning, detectives did more digging. Sure enough, she had been off duty the day of her murder. I remember this episode of Dateline because they did an episode on this one. I remember this one. And just a few weeks into the crime, she reported a gun stolen, presumably because she had ditched a murder weapon. Detectives interviewed Lazarus under the guise of a friendly. Amongst colleagues, they told Lazarus, who worked at the art theft, that they wanted her help on the case. She gave vague answers about how well she knew John Ruttons or his new wife. Even when they asked reports ow, of her jealousy confronting him over the relationship with John. But detectives didn't need her confession. They already had a positive match for her DNA. So in 2012, she was found guilty of murdering Sherry Rasmussen and given a sentence of 27 years to life in prison. Okay, you're a cop, for crying out loud. You would think you would know better, right? Just saying. Alright, number 5. The Innocence Project may have put another man behind bars. So in 1982, teenage sweetheart Marilyn Green and Jerry Hillen were found murdered in Washington Park in Chicago. Anthony Porter was sentenced to death, and after being found guilty of the slayings in 1983, on the eve of the execution, he received a stay of execution from the Illinois Supreme Court, citing concerns over his low IQ. After Porter received stay of execution, journalism students of Northwestern University, participants in the Midale Innocence Project, looked at the case. The students, led by Professors David Protest, obtained new evidence and identified the man who was the serial killer, a man named Alstoy Simon. Showing up at Simon's house, the self-declared investigators told him that they had all the evidence proving the guilt, and that the police were on their way to arrest him. Simon confessed to the killings, and the confessions were caught on tape. It is worth noting that this new evidence included a statement from Simon's now ex-wife and her incarcerated nephew, putting Simon at the scene. To obtain this confession, the students showed Simon's video proof of another witness who says Simon committed the crime. However, the witness was an actor that the students had hired. Despite their shoddy and legally questionable detective work, the students of the Innocence Project were successful in getting Alastair Simon convicted of homicide by clearing Porter's name. So Simon quickly realized that he had been dumped into confessing. He'd been promised a short prison sentence and big money from the investigators, in which he failed to materialize. His defense attorney was also a personal friend of the private investigator working with the students and advised him to take the plea deal. Simon was served 15 years in prison until the county prosecutor took another look at his case and vacated his conviction. In part due to a documentary investigation into the case, A Murder in the Park, the film shows that journalism students neglected to interview witnesses who put Anthony Porter in the scene and didn't fit their narrative, and suggest that Porter may have been guilty to the guilty party all along. So, in 2014, Simon was finally a free man and promptly initiated a defamation lawsuit against the Midale Innocence Project in the school and settling with confidential amount. According to the lawsuit, with the blessing of the Northwestern, David Protest framed an innocent man as the death row inmate Anthony Porter, who became a poster boy for the bid to get executions in Illinois. Number 6. Carolyn Watson. Watson has spent 6 days believing she and her boyfriend have been abducted by a satanic cult. So Watson was 17 and her boyfriend, Butchwell, was 22. They were avid churchgoers in the area of Melbourne, Australia, and they had been dating for 2 years, and Butchwell invited Watson on a romantic picnic in the Australian countryside. As they were driving, Butchwell stopped briefly to get out to inspect a dead animal on the side of the road. That has to be a guy thing. I'm saying that has to be. Next thing Watson knew, she was being blindfolded and tied up to by a balaclava masked man who stripped her down to her clothes, threw her in the back of the trunk, and drove. When the vehicle finally stopped, Watson's blindfold was removed. Butchwell, too, who was nude, claimed that they had been taken by a satanic cult and left alone in the wilderness. He managed to untie himself and help her do the same. The pair wandered, though, through bushland for a week, despite the fact they were both very religious and had pledged not to have sex before marriage. He continually suggested they get married and consummate it then and there in order to stay warm. The frightening debacle came to an end when the duo was found by a farmer who alerted the police. After Bushwell continued to claim that they had been kidnapped, police did discover a letter at Watson's parents' house, supposedly left by the kidnapper, that satanic markings all over it. But after being confronted by police with their suspicions, Bushwell quickly gave up the act and admitted that he staged the whole thing. And asked why he would have his girlfriend go through the ordeal, he admitted that he was trying to convince her to marry him so they could put that celibacy stuff behind them once and for all. Makes me angry on that one. Number 7. Russ Floria. This one you might realize because this one has been in the news here recently with Pam Huff. I still think that prosecutor lost her mind, but I believe in Pam. I really do. Anyway, Floria was convicted of killing his wife, but the real culprit was the prosecution's star witness, Betsy Floria, and her husband of 10 years, Russ Floria, spent Christmas 2011 together. Earlier that year, she had received terminal cancer diagnosis, and despite that, determined to make their remaining time together. The 2 days later, that remaining time was short when Ross had a frantic call, and he said that she had come home from a weekly game and found Bessie dead in their Missouri home. She had been stabbed more than 60 times with a kitchen knife and still protruding from her neck. He told the dispatcher that he feared she had taken her own life to the diagnose to due to her diagnosis. Investigators didn't agree. They found his behavior very suspicious, arrested him for his wife's murder. Her friend, and last person to see her alive, Pamela Huff, which led the witnesses to her prosecution. And she claimed that Betsy had recently made her the beneficiary of their life insurance policies, so she could then pass the money to Betsy's daughters from a previous marriage and bypass Russ. Furthermore, she helped the detectives find a document on Betsy's computer that detailed her alleged fear of her husband. The jury brought it, and Russ was convicted of killing Betsy. He appealed and eventually won a retrial, in which he was not guilty. He was freed, and after spending nearly 4 years in prison, shortly thereafter, the truth started to come out in 2016 when Huff shot Louis Copenhanger inside her home, saying that he was a hitman hired by Russ to go after her. Guffenberger was actually a mentally impaired man that Huff had lured to her home to further implicate Russ. Hupp eventually pled guilty to Guffenberger's murder, and as of 2021 is awaiting trial for Betsy Faria. Prosecutors believe that Huff inserted herself into Betsy's life out of greed, killing her while she was weak from the chemotherapy appointments and framing arrest. None of the insurance money that Huff received went to Betsy's daughter, and police have also reevaluated the death of Huff's 77-year-old mother, who mysteriously fell off a balcony, and Huff, surprise, surprise, was the last to see her alive. Number 8, Nettie Nance. Now, you actually might remember this one because Lifetime actually did a movie on this one. And that is Nettie Nance was 24 when she discovered she was actually Carlina White. At age 17, she was a senior in high school pregnant with her daughter. Excited to become a mom, she sought out the necessary prenatal care to take advantage of the state's benefits. She even asked her mother for a birth certificate. Her mother stalled, and Nettie became impatient, rummaging around through her mother's things, and when she brought the birth certificate, she found she felt in the Bureau of Vital Statistics in New Haven, Connecticut, where she was accused of using a false identity. Her mother and Petway explained that Nettie's biological parents abandoned her, in which is why she didn't have an appropriate birth certificate. The real story was a bit more complicated. Carlina White was born to Joy White and Carl Tyson, a healthy 8 pounds, July 15, 1987. A couple of weeks later, Carlina spiked a high fever, and her parents brought her back to Harlem Hospital, where a nurse told them that Carlina needed to spend the night in the hospital. The nurse didn't have a name tag, but had an odd demeanor. But the tired couple didn't think too much of it. Tyson went home before work and White to grab a few things before returning to the hospital. Just a few moments later, after they left, Carlina went missing, and detectives at once fizzled out quickly, and no other traces of the baby or a suspect was found. White and Tyson, both depressed and angry, eventually drifted apart, and each of them blaming the other for the pain. Ann Petway, who grew up in Bridgeport, Connecticut, had a minor record. In 1987, she told her friends and family she was pregnant, and shortly thereafter she had a note and had a baby as proof. No one knew the father, and she didn't say. So in 2004, pregnancy and subsequent revelation that from Petway started Nettie's own private search to her identity. The family's aunts, uncles, cousins, and grandparents that she'd grown up with couldn't give her any more information about her past. But her aunts did encourage her to call the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, as her aunts in the phone call were led to shared swabs of DNA being taken. The DNA proved Nettie was indeed Carlina White, and her parents were overjoyed when they found out she was alive and well. Carl Tyson and Joy White had been reunited with their daughter in 2011, and she had been missing after she had been missing for 23 years. Jennifer Pan, I remember this one too because Kendall Ray is one of my favorite true crimers, and she talked about this case and everything. But I remember this case specifically because I also came across it on a documentary. I can't remember which one it was though. But she seemed to be the perfect daughter. She was having a perfect life. She was raised in Canada by her parents, Bee Ka and Hugh Han Pan, who both immigrated from Vietnam. I apologize if I'm butchering it up. I am terrible with names. They earned enough of this to buy a home in an upscale neighborhood, drive nice cars, and pay their daughters skating and piano lessons. The parents have worked hard and expected their children to do the same. To outward appearances, Pam seemed like the perfect high-achieving household. The Pams So the night November 8, 2010 came as a shock. Three armed men rushed from the penthouse and they tied Jennifer to a banister upstairs and shot her parents. Her mother passed instantly, but against the odds, her father survived. An investigator spoke with him at the hospital and he had a strange memory. Before losing consciousness, he remembered that his daughter chatting amicably to one of the strangers. It turned out that while Pan seemed to meet her parents' high expectations, she had been living a double life. She kept her academics a secret from her parents, who believed she was a straight A student, but earned mostly B's, and failed calculus her senior year. Because of that, Ryerson University rescinded its acceptance, fearing their reaction. She never told her parents any of this, and went through the motions of her college life, attending freshman welcome week, buying school books, and telling her parents that she received scholarships, so no tuition was owed. So she packed up her school bag and headed out for the day, going to the library and visiting her boyfriend, and even working a part-time job. Pan continued to lie for more than 2 years and telling her parents she'd been accepted to a pharmacology program at the University of Toronto. Eventually, her academic career was revealed to be fiction, that it was, and her parents were outraged. Not liking afterwards, her boyfriend of 7 years, Daniel Wong, broke up with her. Pan was devastated. After reconnecting with her old high school friend, she started imagining her life without her father, whom she blamed for her current situation. She later connected with Fong, and the two began exchanging messages about killing her parents. And Wong had a friend, whom she referred to as Homeboy, and she was willing to complete the hit for $10,000 on a knife question. Pan unlocked the door for intruders, and Pan eventually arrested for stealing Wong, with all of Pan's accomplices were apprehended as well. During the lengthy trial, Pan's many lies and personalities were revealed. The case sparked many a debate. Parenting and psychological impact of pressure on kids. She received 2 life sentences, one for the death of her mother and one for attempted murder on her father. And this sentence includes a non-communication order, if she is forbidden from contacting her father or brother unless they want her to. And I know I said 9, but apparently I missed a few numbers. Number 10. Bernice Novak. Bernice Novak's death was ruled accidental until her son was found dead 3 months later. So, Novak was a widow of the famed Fontainebleau builder Ben Novak Sr., the famous Miami hotel owner who launched into Novaks into celebrities and presidents of foreign dignitaries. Bernice and Ben had been living a glamorous life until Ben passed away of heart and lung failure in 1985. For years after his death, Bernice lived in a quiet life in Fort Lauderdale, but in 2009, she was found dead at the age of 86 when investigators chalked it up into a bad fall that had happened with the amount of brain damage. Nobody asked questions or thought anything about it. That's until her son, Ben Novak Jr. I remember this case. I think it was a Lifetime movie that came out about this. Anyway, was found murdered just 3 months later. Despite Bernice's wealth and prior fame, the authorities hadn't even considered the matriarch to have been murdered. A hard-hitting, motivated journalist, Julie Knight Brown, exposed the investigator deficiencies, but her suspicions was taken seriously until the police, Wyatt Brooke, when Ben Jr. was killed, contacted the investigator of Bernice's death. And some interesting news. They have suspect a custody who confessed to killing Ben Jr. at the BS lowest moments, and the Howard killer also said that he killed Bernice and gave details to the type of weapon. and he used his own weapon he used in how she died. Finally, authorities took a look at the case, and that following year, Ben's estranged wife, Nancy Novak, was arrested for the death of her husband and her mother-in-law. Her brother was also arrested, and the two were found guilty of arranging the murder of Novaks. The defense claimed that the real culprit of Nancy was Nancy's daughter, who was from a previous marriage, May Abbott, who wanted to cash in her stepfather's vast estate, which included expensive Batman memorabilia. The prosecution argued that Nancy had feared her husband would leave for his mistress, cutting her out of their family wealth. Nancy is now serving a life sentence. Number 11. Lynn Turner. After Lynn Turner's boyfriend passed from a mysterious illness, her late husband's body was exhumed. Glenn Turner was 28 years old and recently accomplished the dream of becoming a police officer in Cobb County, Georgia. When he met Lynn Turner, he thought his life was complete. They married in 1993, despite hesitation and concerns about his family and closest friends. Lynn had been cold toward them and controlling of Glenn, in their opinion, but Glenn was also ahead of the nuptials and made Glenn his life insurance beneficiary. The marriage, it turned out, would be short-lived. She ran up large bills of credit cards and spent less and less time at home. Rumors were flying that she had been having multiple affairs, perhaps seeing one of Glenn's co-workers by the end of the year. Turner had accepted that his marriage was failing, and that he told his family he was going to leave Lynn. Shortly thereafter, he came up with the worst flu of his life, telling friends that he could hardly walk or talk. He was so ill. Not long after, he was found deceased on his bed. On the day of his funeral, Lynn made a phone call about Glenn's life insurance policy while en route to the cemetery. Seriously, that's one good way to get yourself caught. Anyway, while some of the suspects Lynn, some say, while some may have suspected Lynn, there is no evidence of any foul play. But for 6 years, former co-workers of Lynn learned that Glenn learned that Lynn had been seeing a firefighter named Randy Thompson and was pregnant with his child. The couple had 2 children and remained together for about 5 years. Though they never married, Lynn did convince Thompson to get her a life insurance policy, and she was the beneficiary. Eventually, Thompson decided the relationship was no longer working and he moved into his own place not long afterwards, and he came up with the flu, just like Glenn Turner. Thompson passed away in his sleep shortly after. His mother, Kathy, contacted Thompson's family. Glenn's mother, Kathy, contacted Thompson's family to a tragic coincidence, and Glenn's family urged authorities to have the body exhumed for a full autopsy could be done. Samples taken from Thompson's tissue were compared and taken from Glenn Turner. Oxalate crystals were found in the tissues and both bodies, and they found one thing there. Both men had perished of antifreeze poisoning, not the flu. Lynn Turner was found guilty of both murder and sentenced to life in prison. Number 12. Blanche Kimball. Blanche Kimball helped solve the 34-year-old case. Chewing gum, in this case, would help solve this 34-year-old case. So, in 1976, Kimball's neighbors started to worry. Nobody has seen their friendly 70-year-old neighbor in quite some time. The police called Augusta, Maine, home, where there was a gruesome scene. Kimball had been brutally stabbed to death and lying in a puddle of her own blood. Now, neighbors were shocked and her friends were befuddled. Pictures of the scene were taken and evidence was collected, but investigators could not make an arrest. The lone suspect they had come up with was a homeless man who was briefly living in the Kimball's home before the murder, and he was seen breaking into a house in the neighborhood not long after the murder. but he fled town before he could be apprehended. With one suspect nowhere to be found, the case went cold. So, 32 years later, in 2010, Gary Robb was homeless living in the streets of Seattle. He had gotten into a physical altercation with another homeless man and was taken cutting his stomach with a knife. The victim fled the scene, but police took Robb into custody, and there was a match between the DNA of Robb's knife and the DNA behind Kimball's house in the murder scene. When cold case investigators in Maine saw the DNA belonged to Robb, who had gone to Gary Robert Wilson in the 1970s, that was his alien name, they had finally had their second chance. So when with the help of the Seattle authorities, the Maine State Police approached Robb on the street and asked if he could participate in a chewing gum survey. Robb was game and unknowingly chewed onto a couple of pieces of gum for the detective, handing them over fresh DNA they needed. Robb was arrested and convicted of murder of Blanche, finally closing one of Maine's oldest cold cases. Okay, what do y'all think of all these cases? Was there any that shocked you? Were there any that you knew about already? Out of curiosity, which five do you think I'm going to talk about in the miniseries? Alright, guys, I will see y'all next time. Y'all have a great day.